So for each of you, I want to know, how did that relationship with dragons, whether it's something that you can clearly remember or not, how did that develop to the point where you wanted to include dragons in your fiction? And how did you go about that process of including them? So Ryan, I'll start with you.
How am I going to answer these questions? I don't know what to do now.
I'm always going to give it to you first, just to
zero prep, improvise. Yeah, exactly. We're all plotting our thought out answers.
This is actually just the stall. I think as I was writing my books, it was kind of just a thing in the background that was always there. I've just always wanted to write a story that included dragons. It's just been a thing for me. I think I was Naomi Novik's series. I think it's called Her Majesty's Dragon now, but it was just Temeraire at the time. Was the first book. That really set me off on. I just love how we were talking earlier about the kind of diversity of inclusion with dragons, but the way she brought it in and kind of used them as all these diverse military units and tactics put into the Napoleonic War, and it was just, oh my god, I love this. Because obviously I'd read Tolkien and I've read like all the different books with dragons, and it's usually this stereotypical, big dragon breathes fire, kills everything. But the nuances she put into the different types of dragon and how they would be used and how they would have to fight in different formations, and I just love that. So after reading that, I kind of went, I want to do something. I've just always wanted it, and then for years and years and years, that was just how it was going to be. There was, no matter what happened, this first series was going to be dragons. There was no choice. Even going forward, it's probably going to still happen.
You're never going to write anything but dragons for the rest of your life, right?
I think what'll happen is I'll write like a trilogy, okay, and there'll be no dragons, and then just like Quenby said at the very end, just fly through, just to say it was there.
You're just going to have a dragon cameo in everything you write, regardless of what it
100%. is. 100%. And even if like there's no physical cameo, I'll have like two characters talking, being like, something burned down a whole town, like at the end, like it had wings.
If you need to add some spice to any chapter that feels a little slow, I feel like a dragon is always a fairly good choice.
It's a good cliffhanger.
Give me one movie. Give me one movie that will not be improved by a dragon cameo where it just burns the shit out of stuff you don't expect. I'm telling you right now.
I mean, I don't know why, but Blade Runner was the first thing that popped into my head, and yeah, dragons would be good.
The Notebook. They go to kiss, and they just... Gone.
Saving Private Ryan. Dragon comes in at the end. That's awesome. Plot
twist of the century. Plot twist of the century. Well, rom-com with the dragon.
Speaking of Saving Private Ryan, Kerstin, what is your approach to
Matt Damon? What?
Can't believe I'm the Matt Damon of this group.
It's a good place to be. So what was your approach to incorporating dragons into your fiction, and why did you decide to do that? You touched on it a little bit earlier.
Well, it's kind of, it's kind of a boring story. So I was, I illustrate, I love drawing dragons, and I was doing that just obsessively for a while. And it was always a common sort of criticism among my friends that I'm not very communicative. Like I'd be telling stories and they'd be lost because no flourish, like no context. Like I went from one idea to the other and they were just lost. Like, Kerstin, you have to really work on your communication skills. I'm like, all right. So I decided to write my feelings after being betrayed by my friends. And I was thinking like, all right, what can I do? And then I amassed all these drawings of dragons at that point. And I thought, all right, I'll start with that. And that's what became Britain Red Skies.
And it's cool because you
such a cool story.
Include some of your drawings in the book, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. And then you're part of a short fiction anthology coming up. And one of the stretch goals was for all the people who participated in the Kickstarter, they would get some original character drawings from you too. So if anyone hasn't checked out Kerstin's art, it's really awesome.
Yeah, I'm really excited that we met all our stretch goals. And that I can draw for such amazing authors, one of whom is on this panel right now.
Quenby. Well, speaking of Quenby.
See, I'm not the only one. I too can reveal secrets.
That's what this panel's about, dragons and secrets. So, Quenby, what was your approach to incorporating dragons into your work?
It's kind of, I didn't read a ton of fantasy growing up. First off, we were poor and I didn't have a ton of books. And I didn't have a lot of friends. Gosh, it's going to be a sad story. I didn't have a lot of friends growing up. I was homeschooled and we were poor and there's this tiny violin playing. So anyway, I didn't really know what to read. I knew some basic, fairy tales, things like that. A lot of what I read growing up was honestly bestsellers like Jurassic Park and things like that. And I also came from a very, very conservative Christian family, so there was not a lot of fantasy allowed. Like basically Disney movies was about as far as it went. So I didn't really crack into a lot of fantasy until I was in my early 20s. And then I just started to devour it. Insane amounts of books. And, that was when I broke into things like Harry Potter and stuff, though aging myself, I think it came out about when I was in my 20s. I was not a kid when it came out. But so when I started to write, I had all of it was new to me in my 20s. I didn't have this whole childhood of, I've read all these stories. I played Dungeons and Dragons. I had none of that background at all. And I suddenly just glutted myself on fantasy and then started to write it. And I had so many ideas then because I was devouring so much that it just started to spill out of me. And I took all of my favorite ideas with like romance and Regency and things like that, and then started trying to jam fantasy into it as well. I know Ryan brought up His Majesty's Dragon with the kind of Napoleonic Regency setting with the dragons. And I read that and it was magic. So fantastic. My approach was basically being an adult, but experiencing a lot of it for the first time with this more kind of adult trying to catch up mentality, and then writing all these stories. So it was weird. It was like I had this childlike fascination with it at 25. And then was this whole new world then trying to put it in my stories.
That's something
that's
special
awesome,
in itself.
Yeah, because you're coming at it as an adult, if we all want to agree that 25 is an adult, 18 definitely is not. I will hold the fort down on that. But you came at it from this perspective of devouring, this pantheon of dragons and fantasy, but from the perspective of someone who I think can much more deeply appreciate all of the themes and nuance there, and hopefully
it's something you hear people say a lot. They always say, I wish I could experience this for the first time or read this for the first time again. So like that's kind of living a lot of readers' dreams, being able to experience those fantasy books at in your mid-20s as opposed to like 15 or 16.
The only thing I'll say against it is if you're an adult reading some of the more classic fantasy books, and I think if you're a kid and you're a little more less experienced, or I don't want to say ignorant, that sounds terrible, but you read these books and maybe you don't realize if they're problematic or if they're not well written or something like that. And you go, this is wonderful. I pick it up now at 40 something years old for the first time after people who they've loved it for 20 years. And I pick it up and I go, wow, what a steaming pile of that is that, now that people have grown up and they've matured and realized this book isn't what I thought it was. So some people, when they read all those books when they were 12, got to experience it in that, sparkling eyed childhood way. And I feel like I missed that a little bit.
There's also been a big shift in narrative structure and writing style. Sorry, I think I have a delay. I didn't mean to talk over you. There's like a big shift in narrative structure and writing style from some of the classics to now. Like if you go and read Dune or Lord of the Rings now, it reads like it's bad writing, but it's just a totally different way of telling the story. And I think omniscient narrator was way bigger back then, and it's not now. And it seems like head hopping if you're not
exactly
nailed in on it, and it can seem really poor. Whereas back then it was just the in style.
Like everyone's attention span was like 1,000% bigger back then, so you could
Mhm.
like just make narrative choices that just don't fly anymore because we're all like little like flies buzzing around with like I get bored of my own stuff like as I'm writing like no we got to move on, let's get the excitement. I'm losing focus.
You have to compete with the phone, the TV, everything else going on in the world. The fact that you can fly to a different country in 2 hours, like it's
Yeah. Well, Brian, this is exactly what we talked about during the TBRCon panel. It's like cinematic storytelling is like the it thing now because we're catering to a new attention span, like a new perception of entertainment, even though I think books is a very antiquated form of entertainment that doesn't necessarily always translate to it compares to a movie or what have you. It's like, now this is its own thing. You kind of need to treat it as such, but readers want this, so who gives a shit? Yeah.
That's why like audiobooks and immersive reading are massive now because they help people focus in. They get the audiobook on, they have the book in front of them, and then they have a whole 3D scope of what's happening.
Exactly.
I've been more to audio, and half it is just my horrible attention span where like even when I'm reading a book that I love and I'm like fully invested in it, all of a sudden I'm on Twitter and I'm like, why the hell am I on Twitter? Like, why did I put this book down? But if I'm going for a walk and listening to an audiobook, I'll actually focus on it and get the immersion. And this is a personal problem for me. I need to work on my attention span, but I've noticed that even just in the last year or so, books that I am just floored by take me forever to read because I just keep on opening social media apps and
just put your phone away.
It's
man.
A tangent, but it's a wild thing.
Well, Brian, on the topic of your attention span, you managed to write 3 books, so good for you. How did you go about incorporating or deciding that you wanted to take your fascination with dragons and explore that in your own work?
Yeah, I actually came into it not from wanting to write a book about dragons, but I wanted to write a book about a dragon slayer. And he needed work to do, so I wound up filling my world with tons and tons of dragons. And but that decision was really kind of on a whim too. I started Blood of an Exile like the day after I graduated from college because I graduated in 2009, like right in a deep recession, and I had an English degree, so no one was really rushing to give me a job, so I didn't have that much going on. And I've been writing a lot of like literary short stories, like Raymond Carver knockoff things. And I realized, I am now an unemployed 22-year-old instead of a college student, so no one's going to grade me or anything on these stories. So instead of writing like something about existential dread of a guy like driving home from work, I was just going to write a story about someone who has to go kill a dragon. I think it's like, this is going to be more fun than trying to like really invest in symbolism and meaningful prose of like, a Raymond Carver variety. And I'm not as good of a writer as Raymond Carver, so I was never going to succeed on that front anyway. So that was the genesis of it for me. I just I had a hangover that morning, and I thought it would be interesting to write about a dragon slayer who had a hangover and had to go kill a dragon. So that was it. And the first chapter of Blood of an Exile is basically, what I wrote that morning.
And a little bit of payback to your brother too. It's like fuck your dragon. I'm going to write about someone killing it. I've had enough.
That was why, the Shibian dragon was so scarred. I was like, I'm just going to write about a guy who's just murdering dragons left and right, and this will be my vengeance.
Oh man. And Evan, what about you? How did you take your fascination with dragons or your history with them and then translate it or incorporate it into your work?
Yeah, I think that initially it was just sort of like, it felt sort of instinctive and I wasn't really trying to understand what I was doing. But then as the story started to sort of form and become a bit more whole, I think what I really liked about dragons and why they felt integral, but also sort of they don't feature heavily on the page throughout the novel or series, is because the thing that fascinated me most about them was the idea of them being this incredibly powerful force, and how there's something about the way that they look like they could almost be of our world, and yet they're not, and the way that they work with the idea of breathing fire and being this massive, heavy creature, as they're often depicted, at least in Western sort of the mythology of them. They can still fly, so they defy all sorts of laws of physics and chemistry and all this, but they still seem as if they could almost exist in our world. And so something about that fascinated me, and I liked the idea of being able to use that and create a secondary fantasy world that had these creatures that were immensely powerful, very frightening, could almost be from our world, and but even in the world in which they exist in these stories, they're not quite of that world either. So I think something about those parallels really sort of kept me interested in the idea of dragons, and yeah, and it just uh, maybe on a very superficial level, it also just made me know I am writing the epic fantasies like I loved reading my whole life growing up because there's a dragon in it. So